G-Stash series. It's episode 2 of the SEDA Stash series, which is super exciting. And who better to have on than Hyperlane? Here we are today discussing unification of fragmentation. I don't think there's anyone better to have on alongside SEDA protocol here than Hyperlane itself. Interop is obviously a massive point of conversation at the moment. Fragmentation's sort of been dominating the mindshare for at least the first 2 quarters of this year, and then sort of shifting into more chain abstraction discussions as a solution to fragmentation. And we're going to dive into it today, but Hyperlane has been leading as a modular chain, offering interoperability services and very complementary to some of the programmable attestation features available with SEDA as well. So we'll dive into that. But the topic today is going to be unifying fragmentation on the back of our episode 1 chat with Nomiel, where we dove into universal inventory. If you missed that episode, make sure to jump onto the SEDA YouTube channel, and we have all the shorts and the full episode there. Likewise, if you're tuning into this one and you want to skip through, jump onto our YouTube, make sure you subscribe to not miss another episode. But without further ado, Nam, thank you so much for jumping on. I'd love to just open up with a quick little introduction on yourself.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me. And yeah, excited for our conversation today. My name is Nam. I'm one of the co-founders of Hyperlane. We are, like you mentioned, a modular interoperability protocol, basically trying to help this kind of fragmentation of the blockchain explosion, like the block space explosion, I guess, that we're seeing. And obviously happy to go more into it as the conversation progresses. And for myself, I'm an engineer by trade, started doing a lot of that at Hyperlane in the beginning, doing unfortunately less of that now. But before Hyperlane, I was an engineer at Cello as well. So been around the block for a little bit and I guess familiar with creating block space as well.
Nice.
Yeah,
Cello was always I remember Cello from 2019, DAppCon, and one of the earliest times I bought ice cream with crypto.
Yes.
They had a little food truck. Cool. So I'm Peter. I'm the co-founder and CEO of SEDA. Now I'm super happy to have you on. Very excited to dive into Hyperlane today. Quick thing on SEDA. SEDA is crypto's most powerful oracle. So we basically allow developers to create totally custom feeds. So you can access any type of off-chain data, whether it's RPC data, for interoperability or chain abstraction to power settlements or price feeds. Before we started building infrastructure at SEDA, we were building at the top of the stack, building a lot of different products around open market mechanics, which we needed oracles for. So we ended up building oracles, over the course of 2020 through 2022. We launched one of the first FPOs on Near. And we expanded that to a few different networks, securing a little bit over 3.5 billion in value at the peak. And then basically went back to the drawing board and said, how can we build an oracle that's really accessible from anywhere rather than deploying to every single chain individually? So that's a quick background on myself and how we got to SEDA.
Awesome. Thanks, Peter. Jasper?
Yeah, I'm the co-founder and CTO of SEDA. Before joining Peter on our journey together through the building products, I was working on a Plasma client funded by EF. So we were working on scaling Ethereum back before rollups, and before that I ran a data analytics company. Now we're here. Now the fun has started. Can I kick off? I have a question.
You can absolutely kick off. Go for it.
Let's go. So there's been a lot of drama and debate on crypto Twitter. It's been boiling for months, and we've had another explosion over the last few days on the intense versus cross-chain messaging sort of debate. And Nam, I don't get it. I think they're kind of the same thing. I think you need cross-chain messaging to enable intents, and I think you need intents as it has different trade-offs. What's your stance?
What is my stance? Yeah, great question. Sometimes people tell me I'm too nice, so you guys tell me if I'm too nice as well. But I guess the diplomatic answer is indeed you need both. I definitely don't think one is the magic bullet, right? I think sometimes intense people will say market makers can solve everything, right? And then message bridges on the other hand will say why would you ever need intents? Asset issuers just will mint every asset under the sun. And I think the reality is just like that, like neither of those worlds will happen, right? And obviously, I said like, I work on a message bridge. I would be very much incentivized to say message bridges solve everything. And I do think they solve a lot of things. Like, don't get me wrong. And I think more and more assets will be issued by message-based bridges. But I definitely think like intents have a very valid place in this market, and are not just here temporarily. And like you said, like intents very much need a message bridge to settle these intents, right? And so I don't even honestly, I don't really get why it has to be this like either or worlds. And I'm sure if you look at the bags, that maybe explains some of it why. But yeah, like in my view, like definitely the world needs both of those things, and I'm very much interested in talking about both to support both, even though obviously like Hyperlane primarily today is a message bridge.
Yeah, have you guys talked to intent networks to see if you guys can help them on the intent settling type of thing?
Absolutely, yes, right. Like I think Hyperlane is probably unique in among message bridges, where I would say Hyperlane as a project never had a first party like liquidity layer, so to speak, right? Like most other message bridges do have one. And so as part of that, I think what is really nice about it, but obviously what's not nice about it is that like when users ask us, hey, like what can I use? Like we can't really like, tell them like, oh, we're working on something. But what we can say is that there's a lot of developers, right, who are looking at message bridges and look at like what is an actually neutral message bridge infrastructure that I can use if I want to build like an intent protocol, right? And so over that course, I'm honestly talking probably to most intent protocols at this point, precisely about that, right? Like as an intent protocol, like you do not want to also take on having to build a message bridge, right? Building the right? Like, and we can get into that as well, like into the like attestations of like, how do you actually secure the message itself, right? And so we think that like for most intent protocols, it just like makes sense to like use open message bridge infrastructure to kind of like build their protocol to settle the intents and like get basically to focus on that layer and let message bridges and the abstractions of that message bridge focus on settlement. And so, yeah, like we have both existing intent protocols that already have like announced their integration on top of Hyperlane. I'm happy to go into those, but there's honestly even way more teams right now that are working on intent protocols on top of Hyperlane. And yeah, we're very excited to like help the facilitation of those protocols because, as I said, like we need both.
Awesome, thank you.
Jasper, can you just help out some of the listeners? Just can you frame what's the conversation on CT? Peter, you've done the 180 on your camera again. What's the conversation happening on CT between intents and messaging? What's the sort of the debate around?
Okay, so the debate is about trade-offs, and people, like Nam said, I think really well, like people see it they try to really make it a super polarized black and white issue where it's a lot more, it's all trade-offs. Everything we're all building, it's all trade-offs. And I like to be honest about those. So I think for message bridging, the story is that the pros are, in theory, they're more reliable. You don't have cost of liquidity. The cons are you need infinite minting, or you need minting permissions on the destination chain. So it's, in theory, it could be more risky in case of a hack. And for intents, the benefits are less finality concerns because you don't necessarily, like solvers can take finality risk. So in theory, you can have a speed advantage. That's actually the main one. Like speed and UX is like the two main ones. And then the cons are liquidity efficiency and liquidity availability. So very large transfers would need to be split up over time using just intent bridges, and during moments of low capital utilization for the solvers, they will see very poor returns. I think that is how I would try to summarize that, and anybody can jump in and sort of like add to those trade-offs.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jasper. I think like from my side, I see it as chains that are new and just launching that don't have sort of like a ton of liquidity providers that are looking to get onto those networks and provide liquidity for intent-based bridges. They'll suffer from just not having tokens supported with enough liquidity. But I also think that there's like one problem behind the scenes, which is rebalancing. With a message-based infrastructure, you don't have to rebalance inventory with solvers across different networks. With intent-based bridges, you have a lot of rebalancing that has to happen. And a lot of the time, your favorite bridges that do intents are either doing manual rebalancing, where they're using a centralized exchange to pass funds back, from one network. So you have to assume that, your new network that you maybe just launched, your roll-up that you want to have interoperability with, also has a sex listing where you're able to off-ramp, different tokens as well. And then you're also taking the risk that, you have to have liquidity providers, like Jasper said, with solvers that can make money there. So I think, message-based bridges make sense for a lot of new networks because they allow you so much more flexibility. I think intents maybe will be very good for like large transfers or like very high used routes, like Ethereum to just Base as an example. And then if you want to go from Ethereum to, I don't know, Chain, you might want to have a message based bridge. So I think those kind of, I think, nail the pros and cons pretty well.
So then following on from that, Nam, you're having a lot of these conversations with Hyperlane, message based bridge, and these intent protocols being on top. Why can't, just to play the devil's advocate or to voice for the CT, why can't we have both? I mean, you obviously think that we can.
Yep.
So what's the story there?
Yeah, I mean, this is maybe where I am not so nice, but there's like a very large meme of like, oh, we're building too much infra, and I think I'm gonna be the one that says like we're not building enough infra, right? Like I'm talking to a lot of these new chains. And like honestly, even if they wanted to use an intent protocol right now, right, they can't, right? Like there's like literally like part of the kind of like I would say focus for Hyperlane, right, is to allow somebody who like launches a new chain, right, that whether it's a roller service, has an innovative alt VM, whatever, like if they launch a new chain, they are like a super great, super permissionless, right, OP stack orbit, super open source. But then when you like need interoperability, like you're like in the sea of like super permissioned like protocols, right? Like you need to talk to a BD team and basically figure out like, okay, who do I need to talk to? How do I convince them it's worth like their time to deploy on my chain? And again, I gotta say like we've kind of seen that with Hyperlane, and we've been like, look, like this is just like not how that's going to work. Like we will not get 1,000 rollups if that's the experience that people will need to have. And so we worked on like getting the message bridge part to these new chains. And I think like, right, like anybody can deploy Hyperlane on a new chain, it's great. But when they want an intent protocol, right, they have nothing, right? Like they have to basically build their own intent protocol. And that's like half the reason why people build intent protocols today is because they just couldn't convince an existing intent protocol to come to their chain. And so I feel like there's basically just need for, again, like open source, permissionless intent protocol infrastructure so that people can actually create this like accessible market for where then solvers could come in and kind of like solve that problem, right? Because like I think to Peter's point, like honestly, like I think we're all kind of speculating for like, right, like, oh, like is it like what are the liquidity requirements for solver to support a like smaller long tail chain? But like in practice, we don't actually know because there's very few solvers like that can actually solve for an intent protocol on a longer tail chain. And so,
Right.
my hot take basically is like we actually need more infrastructure here.
Wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Peter.
I was gonna say like I agree, and I feel like also solvers that have the inventory to do so, right? Like the profitability, and the inventory to actually support it is hard to find, like that trifecta basically.
But I guess to that point, like what if like we don't actually know how much liquidity you need, right? Like maybe you just need 10K for a new chain, right? And like maybe the like chain deployer could like put up that liquidity themselves, right? Like I think it's like I definitely think like solving on like obviously like bigger chains and like just requires a lot more liquidity and like who knows like what direction you're going and whatever. But I think like it's honestly still like even as somebody who talks to a lot of long tail chains and who's talking to a lot of people building intent protocols, it's not clear to me that it's obvious what are the liquidity requirements for a solver right now.
Yeah, indeed. I think that is actually we need some permissionless infra in order to start experimenting with that, I guess. Having people be able to launch these permissionless intent protocols for bridging to long tail L2s would then sort of like showcase like, hey, how much liquidity do we need? And then you can actually start building solving as a service businesses for these long tail chains. And I think that then they have a model, something to model off of, and they can use Hyperlane for rebalancing while also serving these intent-based bridges to these long tail chains. And I wholeheartedly agree with we need more infra. I feel like people that say we need more apps have never tried to build an app in this space. We've tried to build many apps in this space. It's still kind of sucky. We need more UX improvements, and those UX improvements will initially come from better infrastructure. And I feel like we're now actually getting really close. So I'm quite bullish on the next generation of applications, but so far it's still tough, especially if you want to launch an app chain or you have your own I don't know, application specific L2 that you want to build.
Agreed.
But when we go, Peter, go.
Good.
No,
I was just gonna say, like, I had like a hot take. I think it's a hot take. Maybe it's everyone agrees with me, but I think like bridges eventually will die, and just the infra, like when I say bridge, like the UI won't be necessary to go from like one chain to another. You'll have like interop protocols like Hyperlane that are behind the scenes, and just like a protocol will be able to integrate some type of chain abstraction stack right into their app, so the user will never really have the concept of bridging. I'm curious to hear what you think, because I think on the SEDA side, we are believers that the infrastructure is the most valuable piece of that stack, doing the settlement and execution with these custom Oracle feeds. I think that Hyperlane as well has made the very right decision to stay at the infrastructure level and not try to like compete as much on the UI level. And I think that the UI level is catching a lot of the attention right now because it's where the users are actually bridging. But in the future, they won't actually capture any value because the competition is going to be a race to zero, and it's really the infrastructure with the best routes and the most support are going to be the ones that are used. Curious to get your thoughts on that. If you guys have the same sort of thesis around that.
Yeah. Look, I will say, I guess I'll caveat all of this by saying like I'm the tech guy. I think I don't have the best market insights and analysis, but my general view, I guess, in terms of infrastructure is that if you are working on a hard problem, there will just be so many people working on solving that hard problem, and so you will find a way to kind of capture value from that, right? And I think what is actually commodity versus what is an edge, I think is a good question, right? Sometimes you would think cloud infrastructure, right? Seems about the most biggest commodity out there, right? Anybody can run a machine somewhere and offer it as a service, but clearly plenty of margin and businesses that are multi-billion dollars in there. And so I think honestly I think primarily about how can something like Hyperlane basically provide the most value to developers building on top, and generally not too worried about kind of thinking about will that be kind of abstracted out at the top, because that would mean that somebody else would have to be able to do what we do, and I guess maybe everybody will say this, but I'm just looking at what we do, I'm just man, this is fucking hard, and so I'm not too worried about that.
Makes sense. Yeah, I think that sometimes very ambitious new protocols come into the space and try to do the entire stack, and then after they build it for a couple of years, they realize okay, this is a super thick sort of stack that we have to work on. Let's focus on one piece of that stack. Absolutely. Instead of doing every single thing. Yeah, for sure, that makes sense.
Very much agreed. I guess to I think riff off of that, right, that's how I feel a bit about intent protocols, right? Is that intent protocols oftentimes had to basically come up with their own either message bridge themselves or abstraction maybe over other message bridges, and then they realize, oh shit, we are I guess in the message bridge game, right? And even message bridges, right? In the past, basically, right, might have thought oh, we have to solve verification, right? And I think as Hyperlane, I think we guys try to think about hey, what do we think we're good at and what do we think we're not good at, right? And I think honestly, what's very hard is right, what I think what you guys call the attestation problem, right? How do I actually know that something happened on some remote domain, whether that's a blockchain or not? And right, we were just look, people smarter than us will try to work on this problem because there's different opportunities, right? You guys have your thing, right? There's rollups are basically that, right? Just think about how can I verify rollup state on an L1, right? There's zk-like clients. There's all kinds of things that we think are super interesting, and I just think we were luckily not naive enough to believe that we could solve all these things. So we wanted to build a protocol that is kind of modular enough that allows other people to bring the innovation in, so those other people can just focus on the verification part and not have to do what they think we're good at, which is basically the developer experience, the tooling, all those the higher level abstractions on top of the message bridge. And so I forget where I wanted to get with this, but I think the point is that like, yeah, like you should not own the whole stack because that's just like impossible and you end up building a worse product. And I think you want to think about like where in the stack do you think you're good at and provide value there. And that's going to be good.
I have a question.
Go for it.
There. Because it is indeed, this is a philosophical and it's sort of like market and direction question. But I think it's fun to riff off of after what you just said. Because we talked about sort of like the commoditization. We talked about sort of like this unbundling of technology that we're doing now, right? Where we're like cross-chain message bridging, and Hyperlane basically says like, hey, we'll make sure that we'll get a message from A to B, and how you confirm on B that the message actually came from A is sort of like other people can also come in and like build their own solutions for this.
Yep.
Right? So you get sort of like this unbundling of all of the modular components, which is, I think, very good. How big do you think the chances that the edge will be created in the future by somebody being like, hey, let's just like own the entire stack and sell that as a product so that we own all the margins, sort of like the Amazon idea, right?
Yep.
Like of like trying to rebundle the whole modular stack into like a single solution.
Yeah. Good question. I think it is like, I feel like you will always find arguments pro and I guess con like bundling and unbundling, right? And I think like right now, certainly like the crypto like thesis seems to be like, oh, unbundle everything. And like maybe at some point we'll be back to like, right, like, oh, we should bundle everything. I will say as a, I guess, beneficiary of the unbundling, I guess, storyline, I don't know how many like great examples there are of like bundling infrastructure, you know, like I think sometimes I feel like, man, Apple's really the only one that like really like did it like does it well. And yeah, so like that's probably what I would say a little bit my limits of like I don't think I have great examples. So honestly, maybe would hear from you like what do you think would be maybe good examples or like the forces that like bring us back to bundling?
Yeah. So I think that there's one unique thing that gives us modular mullet wearing guys and teams a benefit is that we're building completely permissionless technology. And that's never been the case, right? It's never been fully composable technology that's unbundled. And then I think one of the reasons people start bundling is because they cannot get full access to the services, or the services will try to fuck them over as much as they can, where there's more of a fair market sort of economy in sort of like these fully permissionless composable protocols. So I think that's bullish for what we're building. I think if I would have to point at some successful bundling, I'd say probably Amazon. I'd say WeChat, and then what was the other one you mentioned?
Apple.
Apple, yeah, exactly. So those are good. I think if I'd have to point at sort of like a trend that will result in a similar bundling, I think Chain Abstraction will do this, but they will do this by bundling permissionless composable technologies, and that is new. However, in order for these permissionless composable technologies to exist, they do need to make some margin. So that's where my thought was coming from. Like, hey, maybe at some point somebody will come in and try to like replace the whole thing with like one single entity. But I think also that it will be incredibly hard to do, and we're nowhere close to that yet. But I think it's an interesting thought experiment.
I think one good example is Coinbase bundling, like with Coinbase Cloud. With Base now, like they've started to try to own, like with the wallet as well, when they acquired Toshi back in the day, like they've started to acquire and internalize like different pieces of the stack. I think they've done less infrastructure in terms of like, I don't know, like oracles and bridges and stuff like that. But I think in general, they've done a pretty interesting job having their core exchange business. And I forget what the numbers were, so I won't give out any numbers on this, but I saw like a tweet like talking about Base's like quarterly revenue, and it's like growing increasingly competitive with the exchange revenue, right? And so the seemingly kind of, you know, off the cuff acquisitions of like the wallet and of like a cloud infrastructure provider, you know, for RPC stuff, like it's starting to come together with Base, I think, for a grander vision where it's like, you know, onboard users for the exchange and then get them into like decentralized infra after that. But I think Coinbase is one of the only examples where that's been done well. I think like Binance has tried to do the same with like the like BSC chain, which is kind of, you know, not as popular now. And they also Trust Wallet they acquired as well, like to try to have that. But I think those, in crypto, those are probably the two examples that come to mind when you have like rebundling of something.
Yeah, it's a great example because I wonder, like, like Binance had to basically, right, like build a team building Binance Smart Chain, right? Like they had to like do this like fork of like, I think Cosmos SDK chain, right? Like apply their mechanism to add the EVM. There's been like, especially in the beginning, there have been these like scaling woes, right? And I wonder, right, like to Jasper's point, like if you actually have these like modular like components to build this stack, right? If Binance did this today, right, they would probably just launch a rollup, right? They like probably might not, like they're like drastically reduce operational costs, right? Which allows them to like focus that effort on like maybe the like integration of the exchange itself, right? Like maybe today, right? Like Coinbase and Binance still have to buy a wallet basically to kind of get the experience, but maybe with like right, like more modular pieces, like actually like getting that kind of like experience for the users becomes like just much easier and faster, and like actually have a better experience versus like having to compete as building a wallet. And I mean, I definitely, I guess we're getting into speculative territory, but it would be super cool to see. I don't know, I guess what exchange hasn't tried to do the base playbook yet, but like if they did that today, like I want to know how that will look like.
Yeah, I think like one interesting example is like Caldera. So it's like, I think they're trying to push this forward with having like a bundling of services, I guess. Like it's like Jasper said, it's like a bunch of modular permissionless pieces, but like as an example, if you launch like a Caldera rollup, you can have interoperability with Hyperlane, have permissionless access to data with SEDA, and it's EVM, so you can have wallets already existing, RPC, existing, etc. So I think they're like probably the closest to trying to like bundle it into a package where they point developers to like, hey, here are a bunch of options like this. These are things that you're gonna need to launch your chain. I think that one thing at SEDA that we found very interesting is primarily Oracle's charge like a huge integration fee. And the reason why is because it takes a long time to do an integration on a network. And there's so many networks, right? So you have to prioritize like, what are we going to support? We have like, in the next quarter, we have limited time. So what are we going to support in terms of chains? So we have to prioritize based on integration fee. With SEDA, we removed that tech barrier, right? So now in integration, instead of taking 6 months, now it takes 30 minutes. And I think the advantage that you have there is that you no longer have to prioritize integrations. But I think that will be like an interesting thing to track over time, which is like how will like networks and also protocols that are building services evolve to make sure that they're available everywhere, because that'll be pretty much the bottleneck, is like, how do you as a developer choose your stack if you're building like a roll-up to make sure that it's modular and also you don't have to wait, because in the end, as you know, at building a startup as well, you have finite time, you have finite resources, and if you're waiting for like 6 months to get the infrastructure you need, then you're going to be spending 6 months waiting and wasting resources. And on the other side, I forget the numbers off the top of my head, but there was like a tweet, I forget from who, but about like how much it costs to launch a rollup, and it was like 5 to 10 million if you like count all the different providers that you need in order to like have a successful launch that's usable of an L2. And I think that using protocols like Hyperlane and SEDA, you can probably like eliminate probably 25% of that cost right off the bat, which I think is pretty interesting.
Absolutely, yes. Like I'm very excited, I think, for folks like you guys to come in and kind of like bring that integration cost, because we see this like in the bridging space as well, right? Like it was just, I would say, like 9 months ago where probably the average quote I heard from people was like in the 6 figures, right? And like that has obviously dropped significantly now. Like I think it's even like probably more absurd, I think, in the Oracle space, and what other like some people are able to charge. And so I think the best thing always is competition, right? Bringing prices down. And obviously, you'll have a big permissionless shill in me, because that's, I believe, the only way to get, I think, to this kind of like block space scalability that we need.
Yeah, you'd be surprised on the cost side. I think like everyone, crypto's favorite Oracle, right? I won't say the name, but they can charge up to like $1 million per feed per year, right? Just for the feed to be deployed per chain, and the costs are crazy. And so I think that it just holds back devs building something cool, basically. So
agreed.
I want to move the conversation to, this is a great segue to the Appchain era, right? Talking about this unbundling and bundling, and I think you highlighted very well, Peter, that Coinbase is really focusing on a bundling experience that's beneficial for users. They're funneling in users from the SEX and then bringing them into decentralized infrastructure. And I think RAS was a great example of this idea of like, well, how do we bundle infrastructure stacks to make it easier for developers. Just plug straight into Hyperlane, plug straight into SEDA, and all the other ones. And there's probably pieces still missing from that stack, right? Like solvers as a service, intent engine frameworks, these kind of things that are being worked on at the moment. But now I'm curious to see, with Unichain launching, only a few weeks ago, people are calling this now the beginning of the Appchain era. We're coming into it, 1,000 chains, new chains every single day. How do you see the Appchain era unrolling?
Oh man, if I knew that, I would be a lot richer. But I would say that how do I see it unrolling? So I'm hoping that I think just more people will obviously provide the necessary infrastructure to I think make building app chains easier, right? I think Unichain, we're still talking about a massive protocol, right? It just has like plenty of resources to kind of pull off an app chain. And I think it still takes quite a number of resources, right? It's still nice to be able to go to Caldera, Conduit, launch a rollup, but then you still have this question of how do I get a Gnosis safe, right? That's a common problem we see when we go to a new chain, right? I think block explorers are getting much better there. I think there's definitely still infrastructure that's necessary. Obviously, again, I'm biased, but figuring out how to actually move users between these chains as they proliferate is going to be a problem. We and others are working on that. But then what do you need on top of that? And I do think at some point, right, to Jasper's point, it will get to the rubber meets the road at the applications, right? If this infrastructure is all there and you as a chain, right, as an application developer no longer have to think about this infrastructure and you just click buttons and you get it, then at that point, presumably we as an industry no longer have an excuse for why people can't build these superior infrastructure pieces, right? And so how that will unroll, to be honest, I think I don't know that I have a great answer for that. But I would say that, I think, right, as somebody who started working on Cello in 2018, right, I think there were a lot of kind of considerations of we have to focus on consensus, we have to focus on identity, right, to solve these very fundamental infrastructure problems to kind of then get to the part where you want to build a Venmo experience. And so I think that should be hopefully the only thing that application developers really have to think about, and we remove the kind of scalability and cost and whatever concerns. And I think stable coins, I guess maybe because of their relative low fidelity for application logic, right? That's obviously the reason why we see them having kind of the biggest breakout so far. But I hope we don't just, right, it's not just stable coins and that's it. But to get to this kind of level of financial infrastructure to build these kind of applications, I'm expecting that app chains basically provide that. And so I'm hoping to, I think one of the Gnosis people I think mentioned this, how in a year from now, just building a neobank will just be way easier on the crypto stack than building a traditional neobank. And so from that you will just see, I think, plenty of innovation coming.
Yeah,
I'm curious to ask you on the back of that just quickly. Sorry, Peter. We talked to the Burnt Zion team only a few weeks ago, and two things I want to bring up here. They've alluded, I think it was today or yesterday, this kind of concept that stablecoins are going to play a really big role in the user experience on their chain, and they're obviously going after massive groups of kind of non-Web3 users that can come into the space and just use apps, right? Mm-hmm. So part one of the question, I guess, is what's your take on that? You alluded to it a little bit there. Do you think that we're going to move into this era of stablecoins in the app layer? That's what people are going to be touching. And then to back onto that question, we talked with Burnt Banksy about so chain abstraction and then what? What are kind of the experiences that you see? And I'm curious to ask you that because you've been in the space for so long building. So once we kind of get to this inflection point that we have the infra stack there and it really is rubber hitting the road for the application layer, what are kind of some of the things, the PMF, I guess, or the app experiences that you're excited about?
Yeah, so I guess my experience is quite heavily biased towards Cello, right? And right, the original kind of Cello, I would say, was the OG app builder, right? 2018, we're okay, easy to use payments app. That's what I want to build, right? And it turns out you have to build this whole thing. You have to build you have to fork Geth, you have to rebuild consensus because proof of work is too slow. You have to build an identity protocol because addresses are just not good enough. And then you still have to build a wallet, right? Which is hard in of itself. And then not only that, but you have to build a stablecoin, right? Like in 2018, there was just like what stablecoin was like, right? Like I think at the time, like stablecoins were much obviously like we're not as I think as developed, and even if they just make some of them are still centralized today, like this was still not an obvious option, right? And so fast forward to today, right? Like Stripe just like acquired Bridge, right? Like a stablecoin platform, right? Like I think launching a stablecoin that is actually like reasonable is like much easier than like building your own stablecoin platform today. And so honestly, like one of the things that I still think we're missing, I don't know why nobody has done it. Like honestly, whoever's listening should do this right now. Like launch a rollup where like UCC is a gas token, right? Like I think there's like still way too few people like few rollups where you can just pay with a stablecoin as a gas token, right? Because then like you can build right like a savings account, right? And like you can have basically like in your savings account, you have different modules for like different risk profiles or like whatever, right? Like buy RWAs, right? But like don't make users like have like this like native gas token and then this other like kind of like stablecoin in which you actually transact with, right? And so again, I think this is like part of the like infra that we're lacking. But like once you have that, right, like you as an application developer of again like a savings experience or of like an investment experience, you just don't have to think about those anymore. And I think that's kind of like a bit the like I think breakout that we're seeing with stablecoin in the sense that like again like what you can do today is transfer stablecoins, but you still need to have the gas token. But yeah, I'm just expecting that like building again, I would say like a neobank basically, which is right like hey, I have on and off ramps that are easy. I can like do stuff with the user's assets, and obviously the user can understand what is actually happening in a permissionless way. I think that is, I would say, the like next step function, I guess.
Sounds very unaligned of you to want to have non-ETH on Ethereum L2s as a gas token. No, but I heard Coinbase is considering USDC as a gas token. I don't know if that's true or if that was a rumor, but that would make sense.
I think honestly the biggest piece here is that like most of the L2s, like I mean it's funny because usually L2s have a token. They use like a centralized sequencer, so they don't need a token. They don't have validators in the same way that you would have on like an L1. And so using USDC, like the business model can be built on like we're capturing all the fees, and we're capturing it in USDC, so there's no currency risk. But it's probably just like mostly greed that's holding like that back, you know. And I feel like Base is probably the best one to do it because they don't have a plan to have. I mean, maybe they do. Maybe that's why we haven't seen it yet. Maybe you will have the coin token that will be redeemable with your shares as an example, and that's why they haven't implemented because it does make a ton of sense to just have the user pay in USDC. I remember my first experience onboarding my parents into Argent. And I liked that I could just like send them some USDC, and then they just didn't need another token because they didn't want to hold a bunch of ETH, and they could pay with USDC, and that was already back then, I guess in like 2020, a huge improvement in UX. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what L2s, maybe some founders are listening to this and they're gonna go back to their investors and say, hey, we're scrapping the token. It's gonna be USDC as gas.
Yep.
Speaking of L2s, I want to get this in before we close up the hour. I've been seeing Nyrulf on CT amongst others, really harping on this kind of the alt VM takeover. I think is kind of the conversation that's seeming to frame on CT, and it's quite interesting because I think a lot of us around chain abstraction, especially in our camp series that we did with a lot of the chain abstraction providers, is generally focused around kind of obviously like the L2 environment of the EVM and making that experience completely sort of unified and seamless. How are you guys thinking at Hyperlane about expanding to the alt VM network?
Yep.
Or multiple alt
yeah, so my I guess maybe my like mental model for this year is a bit like programming language or just like what 2 VMs, right? And it's very unlikely, like, I'm a developer myself. Developers will always find a good reason to like reinvent everything, right? Like, oh, like I will start a new programming language. And so I think the fun part about that is, right, like sometimes people come up with completely new like programming languages and paradigms that like fundamentally change everything, right? Like Rust is a great example, right? Like Mozilla just like funded some research of like, oh man, building browser code is very hard, and so like why don't we just like find like some folks who basically build a language that just like kind of has better guarantees, and bam, we have Rust, right? And so my view is very similar in that, right? Like, I mean, what is like like most languages that probably we use today, right, like did not originate when we first started programming. And like, honestly, I don't even know, I'm not that old, but like 70s, 80s, whatever. And I'm just expecting that like people will continue to basically build like, right, like new execution environments with different guarantees. And I think that's great. And again, part of, I think, this like unbundling is that like, oh, if you work on, right, like if you have an idea for like a better programming language, you don't have to reinvent the whole stack, right? You don't have to build a new like computing platform. You don't have to like build like a distribution mechanism for like computers and whatnot. For the hardware, no, like you just build on top of like the layer below to get to reuse all of that. And so I think of like alt VMs as very similar, right? Like we are unbundling, right, like DA, a consensus, and allow people to basically build, right, like new VMs, alt VMs, to again find better paradigms to build these kind of like fundamentally like the fundamental like new thing that we have with crypto, right, is like permissionless application infrastructure, right? Like anybody can deploy these, anybody can use this, right? But like it doesn't have to be EVM, right? It could be other things. And again, I'm very looking forward to people in these other execution environments kind of innovate on top of that. And obviously we believe that that's going to be the future. And so like Hyperlane was very much built with a like how do we like take, right, like we looked at existing interoperability protocols and like basically looked like why would that be hard to kind of extend that to new execution environments. And part of that is complexity, right? And part of it is like it just needs to be fundamentally open source and permissionless. And so I think I'm super like that thesis has played out way better than I thought, to be honest, because right, like we start obviously with the EVM implementation because we are EVM folks, we know how to do EVM best. But then other people in those execution environments saw like, look, like we probably want to be connected to the rest of the like crypto ecosystem, which is primarily EVM. And so like, what do? Right? We either build our own interoperability protocol, or we take an open source interoperability protocol and extend it with an implementation for its alt VM, right? And so that's how we got the SVM implementation of Hyperlane. That's how we got the Cosmos implementation of Hyperlane. I think the Fragment folks just announced, right, like they're like Starknet Cairo implementation of Hyperlane. There's another one that's going to be launching, I think, actually later this week. And yeah, we're super excited for like all the other people who are working on implementations in alt VMs. And we think obviously there's like the network effect of kind of like once you see like 5 or 6 other implementations of Hyperlane in an alt VM, it just becomes way easier to do the next alt VM. And so that's kind of like where I would say also bullish alt VM. Obviously, like in me as like a member of Abacus Works, so kind of like the core team here that I'm employed at, like we are primarily like EVM people in the sense that like that's just what we know. But we just totally believe that like there's no way interoperability protocols can succeed without covering pretty much most VMs.
What is the hardest thing for you guys for deploying to a new VM? Like, what's the biggest challenge that it brings? Is it finding an auditor for a new language? Is it like
yeah, so I would say, right, like, so again, like we don't actually like often deploy Hyperlane, right? Like it's actually like the teams who are implementing Hyperlane who deploy to those VMs. But obviously like people talk to us because we like to be helpful, and like this is obviously like super cool. And I think the hardest thing for us for sure is, right, like we as AVM people are like not like experts in their VM, right? And so like I think the semantics and guarantees that like a VM might provide, and therefore like that you need to be aware of, is definitely pretty hard. And like many maybe other VM ecosystems have like a much more nascent, like, yeah, let's say auditor like history and community. And so there's definitely some of those concerns that are like, I think that are there that I think are difficult. But honestly, other than that, which I would, I guess, mostly call like ecosystem or social aspects of the VM, I've been pleasantly surprised by how easy it has been to implement Hyperlane basically in our environments. And I definitely can't claim credit for it, but I think the abstractions have been quite useful for that. Also, what's been useful, I think, is that a lot of these alt VMs are Rust-based, and so like there's actually like a lot of like reusability among these VM implementations, right? Like I think the Cosmos and like Solana ones, obviously Rust-based, like Cairo is relatively similar, and so that's been actually quite nice, to be honest. So it's been easier than expected, I will say.
Thank you. That's super helpful.
Jasper, I'd love to kind of get your take on that, and then segue into this question. I need to bring this up because it's been coming up in the community a lot, but you know, there's a lot of misunderstanding between like interop, oracles, messages, bridges, you know, because as Jasper, as you famously say, like everyone's solving the oracle problem, or you know, oracle is just taking data from an out of execution environment into someone's execution environment, right? So under definition, a lot of these things are Oracle in that nature. Jasper, on the back of what Nam was just saying, could you also like sort of speak a little bit kind of, I think Hyperlane needs no introduction. You guys are doing amazing things. 70 chains now integrated. What's then the benefit of, say, like a programmable function or programmable Oracle coming in? Speaking of unbundling the stack, having access on day one to Hyperlane and SEDA, what's the kind of outcome?
Are you basically asking me why SEDA and Hyperlane are not competitive? Because that's what it sounds like.
No, I'm not. I'm trying to clear up things in the community, and because
I love to hear that.
Right? I think that's the
yes,
question.
I am asking you that directly here today, live on the stream.
Sorry, I'm very Dutch. I want clarity and straightforwardness. Yes. Okay. So I think Nam put it well himself actually when he mentioned that what Hyperlane's building is a way to get messages from chain A to chain B. And what SEDA is building is getting data from anywhere and landing it on a chain, right? So I think the beauty of, and I think it's also time maybe to drop some alpha here by saying that we are building a SEDA implementation for attestation on Hyperlane, is that if you deploy a rollup and you add SEDA and Hyperlane on day one, you can have a fully decentralized, fully interoperable, sort of like day one access to liquidity without having like, I don't know, like without relying on any third party and having any sort of like centralized feel safe, depending on the data you use. So I would say that Hyperlane sort of like, it's like this message passing system, and we are a data getting system where like we are just allow people to build these programs that say like, hey, I want data from like these sources and I want that fetched in this way, and then you can use that to verify whether for example with Hyperlane you can use that whether a message was actually issued on an origin chain, right? So that's would be my answer. Nam, would that make sense?
Indeed, yes. Like, right, like I think the way I think sometimes people, right, like to because honestly, people's mental models are poor of interoperability oftentimes. But like, right, like sometimes I think like, oh, this looks like this, so therefore it is like this, right? And so I think the kind of the important piece I think to note for folks is that like Hyperlane itself is not a verification mechanism, right? Like we try to like create an abstraction. We call them interchain security modules that basically allow different uses of those verification mechanisms. Because again, it's very hard to build those, right? Like I think what SEDA's building is like fundamentally hard, and so we just knew that like it makes no sense to like marry those two parts of the stack. Let's modularize them, and let's allow folks like SEDA to basically focus on the verification part of like, hey, did a message actually originate from the origin chain? And then like let us focus on, right, like both the developer experience layer of like how are the messages processed, right? Like how are they being paid for, right? Like what can you do with those messages? You can mint tokens, you can have these like cross-chain accounts. And that basically folks like SEDA and others to basically come in and bring their expertise, their infrastructure, so that like SEDA doesn't have to work on all the things that Hyperlane has already worked on. And so in that sense, I think it's like totally natural why people think like, oh, isn't this the same thing? But like, yeah, it is not.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to tell at the top of the stack because everything sounds very similar. Like we also get asked why we're not competitive with indexers all the time. We're like why are you not building competitively with the graph? And we're like, well, it's data, but like a totally different part of the data stack. And I think for SEDA, like one interesting thing, like the arguments I see on crypto Twitter recently, like with a cross versus layer 0 and like this intent versus like message passing protocol. I think that the big thing here, that we sort of focus on with SEDA is that by creating like basically you call them ISMs, right, in your system, by creating a route that you can get like any type of RPC data called in a very specific way and path, and then have that plugged in, it allows developers with Hyperlane to choose like a permissionless route for data, for forwarding. And I think that that's where we kind of create this bread and butter, which is allowing developers to build fully customizable sort of Oracle programs that calls the data exactly how they want. And I think that that's been the biggest challenge we've seen from developers, is that most oracles today are kind of like a buffet where they say, these are the feeds that we have available. Here's how they're configured. Here's how they're delivered. Here's the frequency that they're delivered on. And that's what you get. And please 500K to integrate with you. And then, we kind of see SEDA as like an infinite vending machine. So if you have like, a new chain that you spin up and you want to be able to power now interoperability, you deploy a custom, Oracle module with RPCs and be able to plug that directly into Hyperlane and be able to start pulling, cross-chain messages and bridging. So I think it's a very powerful stack in unison. And for us as well, it's just too much, right, for us to work on. There's so many different layers of this, and we chose like this infrastructure Oracle layer. And I think, that's where the community gets confused because they all interop, but and are all extracted to the user. But for the developer, it's a very specific stacks that you build with it.
And I think we've made our way through most of the stack with at least our camp series, and definitely going to be doing it with the stash series. And I think it's really good to have these conversations. Nam, it's really good to get your point, because I think a lot of what's happening in commentary at the moment is too much around the user experience, and I just don't think we're like. I think it's a very important conversation to have, but I'm not sure if we should be focusing the majority of our mindshare on the user experience. I think if we get the dev experience right, and I think this is exactly what you were talking to, if we get that developer experience right and just make it super simple, super attractive, simple in developer terms, and super attractive to build in the space, then we're going to get, the wave of kind of app developers coming in, because it's now an attractive place to build. It's easy. It's probably fun, as well, compared to like traditionally building on chain. And then from that, we'll get the applications that'll bring in the app users, and what Coinbase is doing with bundling that experience and making that great is going to be super, super powerful. And then we'll see the whole thing coming. So it's really great to kind of get your angle on that.
Maybe just quickly add to that. I think one thing, like I think you mentioned, right, like, we focus too much on user experience, and maybe we would like slightly nuance it and say, like, I think we should totally focus on user experience, but I think what we should not do, which I feel like we just do time and time again, is basically like let the people who focus on the user experience build the whole stack, right? Because that just means that like we wait 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, whatever, until they actually deliver this promised user experience, right? Like I sometimes kind of compare this to, right, like what cloud infrastructure allowed us to do, right? Because like before that, if you wanted to launch something like Uber and Airbnb, like you had to actually build the whole stack, right? Like you had to like actually put machines in a data center and like have like a whole infrastructure team to build this, right? And that just like made it so that like people just didn't build those applications, because obviously like you needed to raise a shit ton of money to do this. And what a cloud infrastructure allowed us to do was to allow application developers who purely focus on that kind of like user experience, application experience, to not have to think about the infrastructure, right? To build the Ubers and Airbnbs of the world, which are themselves billion-dollar companies. And so I would very much like my biggest grief, I guess, maybe with crypto sometimes, I think, is that people just feel like, these options are not good enough. Let me build this in-house. And that just means that like you have to, right, like spend a lot of time and resources. You have to raise like shit tons of money from VCs. So you end up diluting, right, like common token holders eventually. And that's just like not good, right? Like I think it was definitely like valid at again, I'm biased, but like it was valid at the time of Cello, where like 2018, just like not much infrastructure out there. Like you had to do this, right? Like you had to raise 20 million from Andreessen to like do this. But like that's just like no longer the case. And I'm super excited to basically, right, like allow like just random people somewhere in Asia, there's going to be 2 developers just sitting there, and like they will be able to like innovate on actual user experience, application experience, because they no longer have to find a way to Silicon Valley to like raise $20 million. And I think that's what's super exciting about crypto, right? Like the fact that like they don't need like to get like permission from anybody in the US to like build these things. They can just do it. And so I want people who working on infrastructure, on user experience and application experience to do that. Just like don't do everything below that.
Yeah,
let the app builders build apps.
Exactly.
I've mentioned this multiple times in the previous series, but there was this Jeff Bezos quote from the Lex Friedman podcast, and it was like I'm paraphrasing, but he was saying that his goal for Blue Origin was to make it as easy to create a space exploration startup as it is to create like a tech startup out of like a dorm bedroom, essentially, right? So make sure you get all the infrastructure so that it becomes like super easy to just, I don't know, launch a space exploration. And I think that's, if that is possible, then we should definitely be able to do that for
agreed.
some
L2s, even if he has a couple billion, whatever. But like I agree, like if he can make space exploration, as easy as launching like a startup and go to YC, like we should totally make that possible to build like simple financial applications on top of our infrastructure.
Yeah, I think like when we were building back in 2018 this app for derivatives on startups, like at the very start we realized, okay, like we're going to build like our own trading engine, because at the time there like wasn't really trading engines, like AMMs weren't really like a popular thing, and you needed like a stable coin. Then we were like, okay, do we have to like build our own stable coin, because we can't do trading in ETH, because you're like taking prediction market risk where you're trading, but you also then have like the ETH risk. So like what happens if you enter into a trade and you know are like on the winning side, but then like ETH price went down like 50% in the time that you were holding that share, so now like you lost money by entering this market. And I think now for app developers, I think we're getting to a point where like there's so much infrastructure that exists that you can just build an app without needing to like reinvent the wheel on every single thing that you're doing. But I think that, like what you said about like in-house solution, or like basically the solution's not being good enough and then building it in-house, is definitely a super common thing that I think we have in crypto. And it's very frustrating, because like they then eventually realize it's way too thick of a protocol to build, and then they like eventually just kind of go back to focusing on one single piece, which means it just takes time. It takes years of innovation to get back to that point.
This is a very good closing statement from all three of you, because yet again, what we see here is three builders who started in the app layer. I think you mentioned that earlier, Nam. At Celo, you were building apps, and you've all had to work your way down the stack to build the solutions that you wish you all had back in 2018, 2019. And I think that's a really good way to wrap up this chat around like unifying fragmentation, is like the summary basically, right? And feel free to add on to this, is unbundling the stack, but getting people just focusing on a single solution, and then offering that in a bundled service to developers to just be able to ship the applications that we need. This is kind of the end goal that I'm hearing from the conversation. Any thoughts on that? That's the wrap. Awesome. Nice. Well, Nam, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're a busy man, so I really appreciate you jumping on and sharing an hour with us here. Jasper and Peter, thanks for jumping on as well as always. We'll be dividing this up into shorts and sharing it far and wide for anyone who's missed it or wants to recap. And any parting words, Nam?
Nope. Yep. Thanks you for having us, and yeah, like definitely looking forward to obviously the SEDA and Hyperlane collaboration. But also, yeah, again, any builder who's kind of like interested, hit me up. I'm super interested in no more excuses.
Yeah. Sounds good. Yeah. Also from our side, we're looking forward to getting one of these first Interop modules live and start experimenting on our DevNet pretty soon.
Yeah.
Let's get the messages flowing.
Let's do it.
Alrighty. Thank you so much, guys. We'll be back next week with episode 3. More to come. Thank you, Nam. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Jasper. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.